The first thing Keth noticed when the cryopod hissed open wasn't the familiar blue glow of the ship's hibernation bay, but the harsh red emergency lighting that bathed everything in crimson shadows. Her four-chambered heart immediately began its rapid awakening rhythm as her species' natural alertness kicked in. Something was very wrong. She pulled herself upright on trembling legs, her pale blue skin still mottled with the telltale patterns of deep sleep. Around her, other pods were beginning to open with mechanical precision, releasing her fellow Valorians from their 100-year slumber. The journey to Kepler-4 should have been routine. They had done this before, shared vessels with humans for colonial expeditions. The partnership between their species had been profitable and peaceful for over 2 centuries. But this felt different. Keth's large, silver eyes adjusted quickly to the dim lighting as she looked around the bay. Where there should have been smooth walls and standard ship architecture, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Metal plating had been welded over the original surfaces, creating angular, aggressive-looking reinforcements. What appeared to be weapon mounts had been installed at regular intervals along the corridor leading away from the hibernation chamber. By the 7 moons, whispered Jorik as he emerged from the pod next to hers, the elderly Valorian engineer's voice carried the tremor of someone who had seen too many conflicts in his long life. Keth, look at the neural interface panels. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. The standard biomonitoring systems that should have tracked all passengers during the journey had been completely rewired. Instead of the peaceful blue and green indicators that showed healthy sleep patterns, there were complex tactical displays showing ship schematics, weapon systems, and what looked like targeting solutions. How long were we supposed to be under? Asked Lyrina, another Valorian who specialized in xenobiology. Her usually calm demeanor was cracking as she took in their surroundings. 100 Earth years, Keth replied. Though she was beginning to suspect that timeline had been altered, the humans entered cryosleep the same time we did. The ship's AI was programmed to maintain life support and navigate to our destination. Then, explain this, Jorik said, pointing to a digital readout on the nearest wall. According to this, we've only been under for 97 years. We were awakened early. Keth felt the first stirrings of real fear. In all their joint expeditions with humans, the one absolute rule was that both species would remain in cryosleep for the entire journey. Humans were notoriously unpredictable when left to their own devices, and their short lifespans made them prone to impulsive decisions during long voyages. That's why the sleep protocols existed. We need to find the humans, she said, though part of her already dreaded what they might discover. The corridor leading away from the Valorian hibernation bay had been transformed into something resembling a military installation. Gone were the soft curves and organic designs that characterize peaceful exploration vessels. In their place were harsh angles, reinforced bulkheads, and what could only be described as firing positions strategically placed along the walls. As they walked deeper into the ship, they began to hear sounds that shouldn't exist on a vessel in deep space. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal, the whir of industrial fabrication equipment, voices speaking in rapid, excited English. They've been awake, Lyrina whispered, the whole time. Keth nodded grimly. The evidence was everywhere once you knew what to look for. Were patterns on the floors from foot traffic, the smell of cooked food lingering in the air recycling systems. Most damning of all, the subtle vibrations in the deck plating that indicated active machinery running throughout the ship. They rounded a corner and found themselves looking into what had once been the main recreation area. Now it resembled a command center from a military vessel. Banks of monitors showed external views of space, tactical overlays, and what appeared to be detailed scans of their destination planet. Human crew members moved between workstations with the easy familiarity of people who had been doing this job for years. Jesus Christ, one of the humans said as he noticed the 3 Valorians standing in the doorway. Marcus, the Blues are awake. A tall human with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command turned to face them. Keth recognized him as Commander Marcus Chen, the human expedition leader who had been so friendly and reassuring during the pre-launch briefings. Back on Earth, Keth, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're early. We weren't expecting you for another few weeks early. Keth's voice carried the harmonic undertones that indicated stress in her species. Marcus, what have you done? To our ship, Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. I think you mean our ship now. We've made some improvements during the journey. Jorik stepped forward, his aged face showing the kind of controlled anger that came from decades of diplomatic experience. The hibernation protocols were designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action. Both species were supposed to remain asleep for the entire journey to ensure what? Marcus interrupted. That we'd arrive at a virgin planet with our hands tied by committee decisions and alien bureaucracy. That we'd have to negotiate every aspect of the colonization with beings who think differently than we do. Keth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Marcus, we had agreements, treaties. The colonization of Kepler-4 was supposed to be a joint venture. Equal partnership. Equal, another human, a woman with short brown hair and the calloused hands of an engineer, spoke up from one of the workstations. Your people live for 3 times as long as we do. You think in centuries while we measure our lives in decades. By the time we'd finish negotiating the settlement patterns, half our generation would be dead. So you decided to what? Steal the ship, turn it into a weapon. Lyra's usual calm was gone now, replaced by the kind of outrage that made her people's skin flush to deep purple. Marcus gestured to the transformed command center around them. We decided to be practical. 97 years is a long time for humans to think about things, to plan, to prepare for the realities of colonization instead of the idealistic dreams. We sold ourselves back on Earth. Keth looked around the room at the human faces staring back at her. There were at least 20 people here, all showing signs of having been awake and active for an extended period. Their eyes held a hardness she had never seen in the collaborative humans she had worked with before the journey. How many of you stayed awake? She asked. All of us. Marcus replied simply. Turns out human cryosleep technology isn't quite as mandatory as we led everyone to believe. We can function just fine in extended hibernation cycles with regular wake periods. The implications hit Keth like a physical blow. You've been planning this from the beginning. The whole partnership, the joint expedition, it was all a lie. Not a lie, said the engineer. Let's call it an evolving strategy. When we left Earth, we genuinely intended to honor the agreements. But 97 years is a lot of time to think about what kind of world we want to build. Jorik's ancient voice carried a sadness that seemed to fill the room. And what kind of world is that? Marcus, to human world? Marcus replied without hesitation. Kepler-4 is going to be humanity's first true colony. Not another compromise where we have to accommodate alien sensibilities and alien timelines. Keth felt her species' natural empathy warring with rising anger. These humans had been her friends, her colleagues. She had trusted them with her life, with the lives of her people. The betrayal cut deeper than she had expected. There are 8,000 Valorians on the ship, she said quietly. Families, children, they trusted you. And they're all perfectly safe, Marcus assured her. We have no intention of harming anyone. You'll be allowed to establish your own settlement on the planet just separately from ours. Separately, Lyra's voice rose. The planet was chosen specifically because it required both our technologies to terraform properly. Valorian biological systems and human industrial capacity. Neither species can successfully colonize it alone. We'll manage, the engineer said. 97 years gave us plenty of time to modify our approach. Keth looked around the command center again, this time really studying the displays and readouts. What she saw made her heart sink. The humans hadn't just been planning and preparing during the journey. They had been building. The weapon systems, she said slowly. They're not just offensive modifications to the ship. Marcus nodded approvingly. Very perceptive. We've essentially converted the entire vessel into an orbital weapons platform. When we arrive at Kepler-4 in a few weeks, we'll have complete control of the space around the planet. You're talking about conquest, Jorik said, his voice heavy with disbelief, of your own colony. We're talking about ensuring human survival and prosperity, Marcus corrected. Your people are wonderful, Keth, truly, but you think in terms of balance and harmony and long-term sustainability. Humans think in terms of growth and expansion and seizing opportunities. And if we refuse to accept your separate settlement, Keth asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus gestured to the tactical displays around them. Then you'll find out exactly how effective our modifications have been. But I don't think it will come to that. Valorians are practical people. You'll see the wisdom in cooperation. Keth stared at this human she had considered a friend, and realized she was looking at someone completely alien to her understanding. The Marcus Chen she had known back on Earth had been collaborative, thoughtful, genuinely excited about the prospect of building something new together with another species. This man wore the same face but seemed to have been carved from different stone entirely. We need to return to our people, she said finally. They need to know what's happened. Of course. Marcus agreed. But I should mention that we've made some modifications to your hibernation bay as well, security enhancements. For everyone's protection, of course. The walk back to the Valorian section of the ship felt like a funeral march. Kev could see the changes now with fresh eyes. The humans hadn't just modified the ship during their long wake period. They had essentially rebuilt it as a fortress designed to contain and control their alien passengers. When they reached the hibernation bay, they found the other Valorians in various stages of awakening confusion. The bay had been modified with what could only be described as prison features. Reinforced doors that could be sealed from the outside. Internal barriers that could divide the space into smaller, more manageable sections. Surveillance equipment that had definitely not been part of the original design. Keth called out Viren, one of the younger Valorians who served as a cultural liaison. What's happening? The ship's configuration is all wrong. Keth looked around at the faces of her people. 8,000 souls who had trusted in human partnership and were now trapped in what amounted to a flying cage. Children who had gone to sleep expecting to wake up in a world of cooperation and discovery. Families who had committed their entire lives to this venture. Gather everyone who's awake, she said quietly. We need to talk. Over the next several hours, as more and more Valorians emerged from their cryopods, Keth found herself explaining the unthinkable. The humans had betrayed their agreements, modified the ship into a weapons platform, and intended to claim Kepler for to be as an exclusively human world. The reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to despair. Some of the younger Valorians wanted to fight, to find a way to retake control of the ship. The older ones, like Jorik, seemed to collapse under the weight of such complete betrayal. How could we have been so naive? Asked Thiara, a Valorian diplomat who had spent decades building relationships with human organizations. We ignored every warning sign. What warning signs? Viren demanded. They honored every agreement for 2 centuries. Every joint venture was successful. On their terms, Jorik said slowly, looking back. Every compromise favored human interests. Every shared technology transfer gave them more than it gave us. We thought it was friendship. They were studying. U.S. Keth found herself thinking about the years of preparation for this expedition. The careful negotiations, the technical collaborations, the cultural exchange programs. Had it all been an elaborate deception? Or had the humans themselves changed during their long years of wakefulness in deep space? We have to consider the possibility that this transformation wasn't planned from the beginning, she said. Though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. 97 years of isolation could change anyone. Does it matter? Asked Lyrina. The result is the same. We're prisoners on our own colony ship, heading toward a planet we can't successfully terraform alone. Actually, said a quiet voice. From the back of the group, everyone turned to see Corin, a young Valorian who specialized in ship systems. That might not be entirely true. Keth felt a tiny spark of hope. What do you mean? While you were talking to the humans, I've been examining the modifications they made to our bay. They were very thorough, but they're still fundamentally human engineers working with originally Valorian biosystems. Corin moved to one of the wall panels and began manipulating controls with the fluid grace of someone intimately familiar with the technology. They've locked us in, yes, but they've also created something they don't fully understand. Explain, Jorik said, his ancient eyes beginning to show interest again. Valorian ship systems are designed to be integrated with our biological processes. The humans have isolated us, but they've also concentrated all the original biotech in one area. If we could find a way to interface with the ship's core systems, we might be able to influence more than they realize. Keth felt her heart's beginning to beat faster. You're talking about biological override protocols. Those haven't been used in centuries, because they've never been necessary, Corin replied. But our ancestors didn't design those systems for cooperation. They designed them for survival. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Valorian recorded history. They were talking about resisting, about fighting back against beings they had considered partners and friends. It went against every instinct their species had developed over millennia of cooperative evolution. But as Keth looked around at the faces of her people, she saw something she had never expected to see in Valorian eyes. The same hardness she had seen in the humans. The same willingness to do whatever survival required. If we do this, she said slowly, there's no going back. We'll be confirming their worst assumptions about the necessity of controlling us. They made that choice for us when they decided to turn our shared vessel into a prison. Thiara replied, we're just responding to the reality they created. Corin had been working steadily at the wall panel while they talked. Now he looked up. With something approaching excitement, I found something. The humans were very thorough in isolating our physical systems, but they couldn't completely separate the biological interfaces without risking life support failures. What kind of access do we have? Keth asked. Limited, but significant. I can influence environmental controls, internal communications, and most importantly, the navigation systems. The ship might be armed, but it still needs to go where we tell it to go. Keth felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. In a few minutes, she was going to have to make a decision that would affect not just the 8,000 Valorians on this ship, but potentially the entire future relationship between their species and humanity. Options, she said simply. Joe Rack spoke first. We could try to negotiate, appeal to whatever remains of their better nature, find some kind of compromise that allows both species to settle the planet. They've had 97 years to consider compromise, Thiara replied. They've chosen control instead. We could wait, suggested another Valorian. See what happens when we reach the planet. Maybe the situation will change. Or maybe it will get worse, Lyrina said. Once they have the advantage of orbital weapons, platforms and established ground positions will have even less leverage than we do now. Keth looked at Corin. If we tried to retake control of the ship, what would be our chances? The young engineer was quiet for a long moment. Unknown. We have advantages they don't expect, but they have advantages we can't overcome. Even if we could regain navigation control, they could cut life support to the section of the ship. And if we do nothing, then we arrive at Kepler-4 to be as prisoners and hope they keep their word about allowing us to establish a separate settlement on a planet. We can't successfully terraform without their cooperation. Keth closed her eyes and tried to think like a human. What would Marcus do in her position? What would any human do when faced with the choice between uncertain resistance and certain subordination? The answer came to her with startling clarity. Humans would fight, not because they were certain of victory, but because they were certain that surrender would lead to something worse than death. They would fight because it was the only choice that preserved their dignity and their future. Corin, she said, opening her eyes. How long do we have before we reach Kepler-4 to be? According to the navigation data I can access, about 3 weeks. And how long would you need to establish more complete access to the ship systems? If I work with a full team, if we're willing to take some risks with the biointerfaces, maybe 2 weeks. Keth looked around at her people, and their eyes. She saw fear, and anger, and determination. She saw the same transformation that must have occurred in the humans during their long years of wakefulness. The same gradual shift from cooperation to self-preservation. Then we have a week to try diplomacy, she said. And if that fails, we fight. The next 7 days passed in a strange kind of suspended tension. Keth made several attempts to speak with Marcus and the other human leaders. Each conversation followed the same pattern. The humans were polite, reasonable, and completely inflexible. They had made their decision and saw no reason to reconsider it. Meanwhile, Corin and his team worked around the clock to expand their access to the ship systems. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The humans had indeed converted the vessel into a formidable weapons platform, but they had also made it dependent on systems they didn't fully understand. The biological interfaces are more extensive than they realized. Corin reported during one of their clandestine meetings. When they isolated us, they actually concentrated control pathways in ways that give us more potential access than we had before. Potential access to what? Keth asked. Everything. Life support, navigation, weapons systems, communications. The ship is still fundamentally a Valorian biovessel with human modifications bolted on top. If we can establish full interface connection, we can influence any system on the ship. Keth felt a chill, including the human hibernation systems. Corin nodded reluctantly, including those. But Keth, using that level of biological interface integration would be like performing surgery on ourselves. While operating a starship, the risk of cascading failures would be catastrophic, Jorik finished. We could kill everyone on the ship, including ourselves, or we could save everyone. Thiara pointed out, depending on how you define saving. On the 8th day, Keth made one final attempt at diplomacy. She requested a meeting with Marcus in what had once been the ship's main conference room. He agreed, probably out of curiosity about her persistence. The room had been modified like everything else. Where there had once been a circular table designed for collaborative discussion, there was now a rectangular human-style conference setup with Marcus clearly positioned at the head. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. You wanted to talk, Marcus said without preamble. I'm Lee. Stenning. Keth studied the human leader's face, looking for any trace of the man she had known before the journey. She found hints of him, buried under layers of hard-earned pragmatism, and what looked suspiciously like guilt. Marcus, in 3 days we're going to arrive at Kepler-4 to be. When that happens, you're going to discover that your plans won't work. Oh, and why is that? Because you're still thinking like someone who believes they can control every variable. But colonies aren't built by control. They're built by adaptation. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You're going to have to be more specific. Kev pulled out a data tablet and activated a holographic display showing detailed scans of their destination planet. You've spent 97 years planning how to subjugate us and claim the planet for humanity. But have you spent any time actually studying what that planet will require? She manipulated the display to show atmospheric readings, geological surveys, and biological analyses. Kepler 440b isn't just another world that happens to be habitable. It's a world that's actively hostile to human biology. The atmospheric composition will corrode your equipment within months. The soil chemistry will poison your crops. The native microorganisms will attack your immune systems in ways your medical technology can't counter. Marcus was studying the data with obvious interest. We've had 97 years to prepare solutions to those problems. Human solutions, Keth replied. But this planet doesn't care about human ingenuity. It requires biological integration of the kind only Valorians can provide. Our people don't just adapt to alien environments. We become part of them. She changed the display to show comparative biological models. Your weapons platform can control the space around Kepler 440b. Your technology can establish temporary settlements, but without Valorian biological integration, those settlements will fail within a generation. You're assuming we'll honor our agreement to let you establish a separate settlement, Marcus said quietly. Keth felt her heart skip. Are you saying you won't? I'm saying that 97 years is a long time to think about the practical realities of maintaining separate populations on a hostile world. It would be much more efficient to integrate our populations under unified human leadership. The words hit Keth like a physical blow. You're talking about enslavement. I'm talking about survival. Yours and ours. Keth stared at this human, who had once been her friend, and realized that somewhere during those long years of wakefulness, Marcus had convinced himself that betrayal was mercy, that controlling another species was somehow saving them. You're wrong about one thing, she said, as she stood to leave. You think you've spent 97 years planning how to control us, but we've just spent the last 2 weeks learning how to control you. Marcus laughed. Keth, you're locked in a converted hibernation bay with no access to ship systems, and no way to communicate with the outside universe. What exactly do you think you can control? Keth paused at the door and looked back at him. Everything, Marcus. We can control everything. She left him sitting there with his confidence intact, knowing that in less than 72 hours, he would discover exactly how wrong he had been about Valorian capabilities. The final preparations took place in an atmosphere of grim determination. Corin had succeeded in establishing biological interface connections with every major ship system. The process had been exhausting and dangerous, requiring volunteers to undergo surgical integration with biomechanical interfaces that hadn't been used in centuries. Are we really going to do this? Asked Viren as they made their final preparations. Are we really going to become everything they feared we might be? Keth looked around at her people. Many of them showed signs of the biological modifications necessary to interface with the ship systems. Others carried the haunted look of people preparing to do something that went against their fundamental nature. They made the choice for us, she said. We can be victims of their betrayal, or we can be survivors of it. The plan was complex but straightforward. Using their biological interfaces, they would simultaneously take control of navigation, life support, and communications. The humans would find themselves locked in their own sections of the ship, with their weapon systems offline and their hibernation bay sealed. What about after? Asked Lyrina. What happens when we reach the planet? We negotiate from a position of strength instead of weakness, Keth replied. We find a way to build something together, or we find a way to build something separately. But we do it as equals. Jorik, who had been quiet during most of the planning, finally spoke up. This changes us, you know. Once we do this, we can't go back to being the species that trusted humans unconditionally. Good. Thiara said with surprising vehemence. Maybe it's time we stopped being so trusting. Keth understood the old engineer's concerns. They were about to cross a line that Valorian civilization had never crossed before. They were about to choose conflict over cooperation, self-preservation over trust. But as she looked around at the faces of her people, she realized that line had already been crossed. The humans had crossed it 97 years ago when they decided to stay awake and plan betrayal. The Valorians were just now catching up positions. She said quietly. The takeover happened with shocking speed. One moment the ship was under human control, and the next moment every system was responding to Valorian biological commands. Doors sealed automatically, locking human crew members into their respective sections. Weapon systems powered down and refused to respond to human input. Most critically, The human hibernation bay was sealed with everyone inside. Keth felt the ship's systems flowing through her consciousness like an extension of her own body. It was overwhelming and intoxicating and terrifying all at once. She could sense every human heartbeat, monitor every conversation, control every aspect of their environment. Status, she called out. Navigation is under our control, reported Corin. Course is set for Kepler 4 to be, arrival in 68 hours. Life support? All sections are maintaining optimal environments. Humans are contained but not harmed. Communications, internal. Communications are under our control. I'm monitoring human frequencies. They're not happy. Keth could imagine. She activated the ship's internal communication system and spoke directly to the human sections. This is Keth speaking to all human crew members. You are unharmed and will remain so as long as you remain calm. We have taken control of the ship and will maintain control until we reach our destination. Marcus's voice came back almost immediately, tight with controlled anger. Keth, you have no idea what you're doing. You don't understand the technical complexities of operating this vessel. We understand them better than you do, she replied. This was originally a Valorian bioship. Remember, you've been passengers on our vessel for 97 years. If you maintain this course of action, you'll be confirming every human suspicion about alien trustworthiness. You'll be starting a war between our species. Keth felt a moment of doubt. Was Marcus right? Were they about to trigger something larger and more destructive than their current situation? Then she remembered the weapon systems the humans had built, the prison they had constructed around her people, the casual way Marcus had discussed enslaving an entire species for their own good. You started this war 97 years ago, she said. We're just finishing it. The next 68 hours were unlike anything in recorded history. Two intelligent species, locked in the same vessel, heading toward a planet neither could successfully colonize alone. Each convinced that the other represented an existential threat. The humans made several attempts to regain control of ship systems. All failed. The Valorian biological interfaces were too deeply integrated into alien for human understanding. The Valorians maintained their control, but found it increasingly exhausting. The level of biological integration required to operate the ship was draining their people in ways they hadn't anticipated. As they approached Kepler 4 to be, both species faced the same uncomfortable reality. They needed each other to survive, but trust had been completely destroyed. Incoming communication from the planet's surface, reported the Valorian monitoring communications. Keth felt her heart skip. From the surface, that's impossible. We're the first expedition to this system. I'm reading multiple transmission sources. They're using both human and Valorian communication protocols. The main display activated, showing the blue-green curve of Kepler 4 to be growing larger as they approached. But superimposed over the planetary image were transmission data that made no sense. This is Colonial Administrator Sarah Chen calling the approaching vessel. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. Keth stared at the display in shock. Chen was Marcus's family name, but that was impossible unless... How long have we actually been traveling? She asked Corin urgently. The young engineer was frantically checking navigation data. According to the ship's chronometer, 97 years. But according to the stellar positioning data, Keth, we've been traveling for over 150 years. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. The humans hadn't just been awake for 97 years. They had been awake for the entire journey. And they had been in communication with someone. This is Commander Marcus Chen of the colony ship Harmony. Marcus's voice came over the communication system. He had somehow regained access to external communications. Sarah, we have a situation here that requires immediate consultation. Marcus, the voice from the planet's surface, carried obvious surprise. You're not supposed to arrive for another 3 years. And why are you transmitting on emergency frequencies? Keth felt the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The humans hadn't just betrayed their current agreement. They had been planning a completely different betrayal from the very beginning. There's already a human colony on Kepler 4 to be, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They've been planning this for generations. Over the next several hours, the true scope of human deception became clear. The colony ship Harmony hadn't been the first expedition to Kepler 4 to be. It had been the third. Previous ships had established a thriving human settlement over the past 2 centuries. The Valorians had been invited on this journey not as partners, but as subjects for study. The humans wanted to understand Valorian biological integration capabilities so they could replicate them artificially. 200 years, Jorek said, his ancient voice heavy with disbelief. They've been studying us for 200 years, learning everything they could about our biology. Our technology, our psychology, and now they have everything they need, Lyrina added. They have 8,000 Valorians in a controlled environment, detailed biological data from 97 years of observation, and a planet where they can conduct whatever experiments they choose. Keth stared at the growing image of Kepler 442b and realized they had been trapped in a scenario with no good outcomes. They could maintain control of the ship, but they were heading toward a planet controlled by humans who had been preparing for their arrival for decades. They could try to turn around, but they didn't have enough resources for another interstellar journey. We need to talk to the colony, she said finally. All of us, humans and Valorians together. We need to understand exactly what we're flying into. The conversation that followed was conducted with all parties on the ship's main communication system, the human colony on Kepler 442b, represented by Colonial Administrator Sarah Chen, explained the situation with matter-of-fact efficiency. The planet has been successfully terraformed using a combination of human technology and artificially replicated Valorian biological processes. We've established 17 cities with a total population of approximately 2 million humans and Valorians, Keth asked. We have a research population of about 3,000 Valorians who have been working with us to develop the terraforming technologies. They've been very helpful. Keth felt sick. Working with you voluntarily define. Voluntary, Sarah replied. They're well treated, well housed, and their contributions are valued. They just don't have the option to leave. Marcus's voice cut in. Sarah, the situation up here has become complicated. The Valorians have taken control of the ship. How? Is that possible? Your reports indicated they would remain in hibernation for the entire journey. We underestimated their capabilities. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Marcus, are you telling me that 8,000 Valorians are about to arrive at our planet, under hostile control of a weapons platform? Keth realized with sudden clarity that they were all trapped in a scenario that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The humans on the planet saw them as an invasion force. The humans on the ship saw them as escaped prisoners. And the Valorians were beginning to understand that they had never been partners in anything. This is Keth, speaking as the elected representative of the Valorians on the ship, she said, her voice carrying the harmonics of formal authority. We are not invaders. We are not prisoners. We are people who were betrayed by those we trusted, and we are trying to find a way to survive that betrayal. Keth. Sarah's voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy. I understand your position, but you have to understand mine. You're approaching my world with a ship full of weapons, and a population that outnumbers my colonists 4 to 1. Then we need to find a solution that doesn't involve anyone pointing weapons at anyone else. Keth replied, because if we don't, we're all going to die on a planet that requires cooperation to survive. The next 12 hours were spent in the most complex negotiation in the history of either species. Humans on the ship, humans on the planet, and Valorians who had discovered that everything they thought they knew about human-Valorian relations had been a lie gradually. The outlines of a possible solution began to emerge. It wasn't the partnership the Valorians had originally envisioned, and it wasn't the total control the humans had planned. It was something messier and more uncertain than either species preferred. The Valorians would be allowed to establish their own settlements on Kepler 442b, but under a joint governance structure that acknowledged human numerical superiority on the planet. The humans would gain access to genuine Valorian biological integration technology, but only through willing cooperation, not forced study. Most importantly, both species would work together to establish communication with their respective homeworlds and create new agreements that acknowledge the realities they had discovered. During this journey, it's not ideal, Keth admitted as she addressed her people. We're not going to be equal partners in the way we originally hoped, but we're going to be free, and we're going to have a chance to build something real. And if the humans break these agreements like they broke all the others, asked Thiara. Keth gestured to the bio-integrated control systems around them. Then we'll be ready for that too. As the ship Harmony entered orbit around Kepler 442b, both species faced an uncertain future. The trust that had once existed between humans and Valorians had been shattered, perhaps permanently, but something else had taken its place. A wary respect based on demonstrated capabilities. Rather than naive assumptions, the Valorians had learned that their peaceful nature could be a weakness when dealing with species that thought differently. The humans had learned that their assumptions about alien predictability had nearly led to catastrophe. The orbital insertion went smoothly, with Valorian biosystems handling the complex gravitational calculations while human engineering managed the mechanical stress on the ship's modified structure. It was, Keth reflected, probably the first genuinely cooperative effort between the species in over a century. Surface Control is requesting permission to dock with our vessel," reported Corin from the navigation station. "They want to send up a diplomatic team." Keth looked around the command center at the mixed group of humans and Valorians who had been working together for the past 12 hours. The atmosphere was still tense, but the immediate hostility had faded into something more like professional wariness. "Permission granted," she said, "but the diplomatic team includes representatives from both species. We all need to see what we're dealing with down there." Marcus, who had been surprisingly cooperative since the negotiations began, nodded his agreement. "I want to see what my daughter has built down there anyway." The comment caught Keth off guard. "Your daughter, Sarah Chen, Colonial Administrator Sarah Chen. She's my great-great-granddaughter." The humans who established the colony weren't just any humans. They were specifically chosen family members of the expedition crew. Another piece of the larger picture fell into place. The human betrayal hadn't been opportunistic. It had been planned across generations, with family members establishing colonial infrastructure while their relatives guided the research subjects to their destination. "How many other expeditions were like ours?" Keth asked quietly. Marcus met her eyes without flinching. 17. Over the past 2 centuries, we've sent 17 joint expeditions to different worlds, all following the same basic pattern. The magnitude of human deception was staggering. Not just one betrayal, but a systematic program of using other species as unwitting research subjects, while establishing exclusively human colonies throughout the galaxy. And the Valorians who were already on the planet, the 3,000 research subjects there from the previous expeditions, Marcus admitted, volunteers and non-volunteers who have been helping us understand biological terraforming processes. Keth felt her anger rising again, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting angry now wouldn't help her people. Understanding the full scope of what they were dealing with might. The docking process took several hours, during which time both ships shared data about the planetary situation. What emerged was a picture of a world that was indeed successfully terraformed, but at a cost that neither species had fully anticipated. The artificially replicated Valorian biological processes had worked, but they required constant maintenance by actual Valorians. The human population was completely dependent on their Valorian research subjects, though they had been careful not to acknowledge that dependency publicly. "Interesting," observed Jorik as he studied the planetary data. "They need us more than they admitted, but they have more leverage than we do," Lirina pointed out. "They control the infrastructure, the resources, and the communication systems." When the diplomatic shuttle finally docked with their ship, the team that emerged was unlike anything Keth had expected. 3 humans and 2 Valorians, all showing signs of extended cooperation rather than the master-subject relationship she had feared. The lead human was indeed Sarah Chen, and the family resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable. But her manner was different from the humans on the ship. More cautious, more aware of complexity. The Valorians with her were older individuals who carried themselves with the dignity of people, who had maintained their self-respect despite difficult circumstances. When they saw Keth and the other shipboard Valorians, their expressions showed a mixture of hope and wariness. "I'm therein," said the senior Valorian diplomat. "I've been serving as liaison between the Valorian research community and the colonial administration for the past 30 years. Research community?" Keth asked. "Is that what they call you?" Theron's expression grew complex. "It's what we call ourselves." The alternative descriptions would be less diplomatic. Sarah Chen stepped forward. "I think we all need to be honest about what's been happening here. The colonial project has been successful, but it's also been built on foundations that no one is particularly proud of." Over the next several hours, the true situation on Kepler for to became clear. The human colony was thriving, but it was essentially dependent on biological systems that required Valorian maintenance. The Valorians on the planet had been well treated, but were essentially prisoners with comfortable accommodations. Both groups had been gradually working toward a more equitable arrangement, but they had been constrained by directives from Earth and by the arrival schedule of new research subjects. "The arrival of your ship changes everything," Sarah explained. 8,000 new Valorians fundamentally alters the demographic balance on the planet. "We can't maintain the previous arrangements with those numbers. And we won't," Keth said firmly. "We're not research subjects. We're colonists who happen to have been betrayed by our transportation providers." Theron looked at her with something approaching admiration. "You took control of the ship? How?" Corin stepped forward and explained the biological interface process they had developed. As he talked, Keth could see understanding dawning in the faces of the planetary Valorians. They hadn't known about the ship modifications, hadn't realized that their shipbound kin had essentially been handed the tools for resistance. This changes the negotiation parameters significantly, Sarah said slowly. If you can maintain control of orbital systems, we can, Keth confirmed. The question is whether we need to. What followed was the most complex diplomatic discussion in the history of either species, not just because of the immediate situation, but because they were essentially negotiating the future relationship between humans and Valorians throughout the galaxy. The humans had established colonies on 17 worlds using Valorian research subjects. Those colonies were successful, but dependent on continued Valorian cooperation. The Valorians now had demonstrated capability to resist human control, but they were still outnumbered and isolated. We need a new model, Theron said eventually. Something that acknowledges the realities of what's been built, while creating genuine partnership for the future. Partnership requires trust, Marcus observed. And trust is something we've systematically destroyed. Then we build something that doesn't require trust, Keth replied. We build something that works because it's in everyone's interest for it to work. The solution they eventually developed was unlike anything either species had attempted before. Instead of trying to create trust-based cooperation or dominance-based control, they created interdependence-based collaboration. The humans would maintain control of industrial and technological infrastructure, areas where their shorter lifespans and rapid innovation gave them advantages. The Valorians would maintain control of biological and environmental systems, areas where their longer lifespans and integrated thinking provided benefits. Neither species could replicate artificially, neither group would be able to survive without the other, but neither group would be subordinate to the other. It's not the partnership we originally envisioned, Keth told her people as they prepared for planetary settlement. But it might be something better. It's a partnership based on reality instead of idealism. The settlement process took months, during which both species learned to work together in ways they had never attempted before. Humans learned to think in the longer time scales that Valorian biology required. Valorians learned to make the rapid decisions that human lifespans demanded. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, and moments when the entire arrangement seemed ready to collapse. But gradually, something new began to emerge. Not the naive cooperation of their original agreements, and not the hostile control the humans had attempted, but a wary, practical collaboration based on mutual necessity. 6 months after the arrival of the Harmony, Keth stood on a hill overlooking the first genuinely integrated settlement on Kepler 442b. Human buildings rose next to Valorian biostructures. Human children played with young Valorians in carefully maintained environmental zones that accommodated both species' needs. It wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But it was working. Any regrets? Asked Theron as he joined her on the hillside. The older Valorian had become something like a mentor during the settlement process. Keth considered the question. About taking control of the ship? No. About discovering what humans are really like sometimes. They're not what we thought they were. Theron agreed. But then again, we're not what we thought we were either. Keth nodded. The Valorians who had taken control of the Harmony were different from the Valorians who had entered cryosleep over a century ago. They were harder, more suspicious, more willing to fight for what they needed. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? She asked. It's a survival thing, Theron replied. And survival is what allows everything else to be possible. Down in the settlement, she could see Marcus working with a mixed team of humans and Valorians on some kind of infrastructure project. He looked older than his biological age, worn down by the weight of choices he had made over the course of the journey. They had talked several times since the settlement began. Not as friends. That was probably impossible now. But as leaders, trying to build something that would work for both their peoples. Do you think he believes what he told us? Keth had asked Theron after one of those conversations, about thinking he was protecting us. I think he believes it now, Theron had replied. Whether he believed it when he made the original decisions, that's a different question. The communication ray that would eventually contact both Earth and the Valorian homeworld was still months away from completion. When those communications were finally sent, they would carry news that would shock both civilizations. Humans would discover that their colonial program had been exposed, and that their research subjects had developed the capability to resist. Valorians would discover that their people had been systematically deceived and exploited, but had also proven capable of adaptation and survival in ways their peaceful society had never tested. Both revelations would trigger changes that would ripple through the galaxy for generations, but that was a problem for the future. For now, Keth was focused on the more immediate challenge of building a society that could work for both species without requiring either to surrender their essential nature. Message from the orbital station, called Corin as he approached their position on the hill. They're requesting permission to begin the next phase of terraforming expansion. Keth looked at Theron, who nodded. Permission granted, she replied. But remind them that all expansion decisions require joint approval from both species councils. As Corin returned to the settlement to relay the message, Keth reflected on how much had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a naive Valorian who believed in the possibility of simple cooperation between species. Now she was a colonial leader who understood that real cooperation required constant negotiation and mutual respect for each other's capabilities. The sun set over Kepler 442b, painted the sky in colors that neither human nor Valorian eyes had evolved to see. It was beautiful in ways that required both species' perspectives to fully appreciate. Human eyes caught the dynamic interplay of light and atmospheric particles. Valorian eyes perceived the biological rhythms and the way the light interacted with the planet's living systems. Together, they saw something neither could see alone. That's the metaphor for this whole experiment, isn't it? Keth said as she watched the alien sunset. What is? Theron asked. We can see things together that neither of us can see alone. We just had to stop trusting each other enough to start respecting each other. As night fell over the first integrated settlement on Kepler 442b, lights began to appear throughout the community. Human electrical systems created steady, reliable illumination. Valorian bioluminescent systems provided softer, more organic lighting that responded to the needs of the inhabitants. The combination created something entirely new. Not human, not Valorian, but something that worked for both. It wasn't the partnership they had originally dreamed of. It was something harder, more complex, and more honest. And for the first time since waking from cryosleep, Keth thought it might actually be better.